Hi all, thank you for joining. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. All right, since it's a couple minutes after 12, we'll go ahead and get started. I want to personally welcome everybody to the Coastal Observing in Your Community webinar series hosted by SECOORA. The webinar series is being held to celebrate SECOORA's 10-year anniversary, and the point is to discuss and highlight coastal ocean observing in the Southeast U.S. Monthly invited speakers will discuss ocean observing topics. Each webinar will be 60 minutes and recorded and archived for future viewing. My name is Abby, SECOORA's Communications Director, and I will be facilitating and moderating the webinar. All participants will be in listen-only mode. You can type any questions for the presenters or technical questions in the bottom left-hand chat box. I will respond to them directly or post the questions to our presenters after their presentations. As a reminder, we are recording this webinar today and it will be available on the SECOORA website. We are very, very excited to welcome a great group of speakers presenting on the web camera applications Testbed project, also known as WebCAT. Today we have Debra Hernandez, SECOORA's Executive Director, Mark Willis, the Chief Meteorologist at Surfline, Joseph Long, a Research Oceanographer at USGS, Greg Dusek, a Senior Scientist at NOAA NOS Co-op, and Dwayne Porter, a Professor at University of South Carolina. I want to thank you all so much for joining us. And Debra, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can get started.
Great. Thanks so much, Abby, and welcome everyone to our webinar today. I'm excited to be able to introduce y'all to a project that really just got started this summer. It's a great collaboration among a number of partners. And I'll be doing sort of a high-level introduction, and then we'll hear from some of the rest of the project team. So next slide, Abby. As Abby said, I'm the Executive Director for SECOORA, and we were able to collaborate with some folks and compete successfully for some funding out of the National Ocean Service. So once you hear from me, the overview of the project, I'll introduce Mark Willis, who will talk about Surfline's role, and then we'll also hear from some of the other project team members who will be using the web camera data for various applications related to the things we all care about. And then we'll close by giving some time for questions from all of you. Next slide. So our funding, as I said, was through the National Ocean Service and from the Integrated Ocean Observing System Office, also at NOAA, so IOOS. It is a one-year project, and it aligns with 3 of NOAA's primary missions and goals, the first being preparedness and risk reduction, the second, safe and efficient transportation and commerce, and the third, stewardship, recreation, and tourism. Next slide. So this is all the logos for our project team members. As I said, funding came from the IOOS program and from NOAA NOS. SECOORA is a nonprofit. We also have 2 private sector partners, Surfline, who you're going to hear from today, and then Axiom Data Science, who's our data manager on this project. And then we have some other parts of NOAA engaged with us, the National Weather Service, the Center for Operational Oceanographic Products and Services, or co-ops, and then also the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. Next slide. So most of the funding from this project is going to install 5 new web cameras. We'll be collecting a full year of data, and then that data will be made available on SECOORA's website. The overall objective of this project was to enable discussion and collaboration among the various folks within NOAA and NOAA's partners, both within the federal agency and outside of the federal government, so that we could learn from each other on how to effectively utilize web camera data to more efficiently collect the environmental data that's needed to answer some of the questions that we all care about related to storm surge, waves, wave run-up, and usage of the coast and ocean and how that might impact things like water quality. So next slide. The video data will be processed through our partner Axiom Data Science in collaboration with Surfline and made available on the SECOORA website. It'll be provided in 1-hour links and will be downloadable and watchable from the SECOORA portal. We're going to also enable those who will be analyzing the data to use the SECOORA Research Workspace and via that platform to run various scripts to analyze the video camera data. Axiom is also working on some special cases that some of our data users have asked for example, looking at the first 10 minutes at the top of each hour, or looking at the time lengths of the video around high and low tide, so that it can more specifically be directed to answer the questions that our researchers are investigating. And one of the questions we'd like addressed as we have time for questions is how some of you in the audience might be interested in using the data. Next slide. So I would like to point out that this project is a partnership. It's nonprofit, which is SECOORA. It's the private sector, which is Surfline and Axiom. And then it's also public sector, which includes the federal government and some of our university partnerships. And we think that will enable what we learned during this project to reach a really broad audience. That's our hope, that will establish this network and create a foundation that will enable stronger collaboration and easier sharing of lessons learned in terms of using camera data to answer questions related to our coastal environment. Next slide. Another part of the project is a workshop that will be held in the spring of this year. So if you're interested, we want you to let us know. The format for the workshop is still being finalized, but we anticipate having presentations that explore the various applications of camera data, some of the opportunities and challenges, particularly with managing the data, and then present some use cases from those who are participating in the project. And our primary audience, we expect, will be resource managers, data managers, we're just beginning to use video cam data for environmental monitoring. And so look for that announcement with more details probably in the January to February timeframe of 2018. And I think, Abby, that is my last slide. And then I'll be turning it over to Mark Willis with Surfline to talk about their role. They bring a lot of expertise in web camera management, which is why they're being a great partner on this project. So Mark, I'll hand it off to you.
All right, thank you, Debra. Before I begin, Abby, can you see my slides?
Yes, I can see it. Looks great.
All right, so Surfline has been a member of SECOORA, I guess, for about 2 years now, and it's opened up a lot of great opportunities for us. But perhaps none of those opportunities are more exciting than what we're talking about today, and it's this webcam project. And we're kind of looking at this as a proof of concept. It's, in our opinion, kind of a small project, and I just think what we're learning as we go through this is opening up a lot of doors and a lot of potential, and I'm hoping it will lead to bigger and better things for SECOORA and everyone involved, because I'm really gung-ho about this and excited about the future. I realize there's a wide range of backgrounds in this call, so I'm going to be really high level. And I also wanted to start with a little asterisk that I'm a meteorologist. I'm not necessarily a cam technician, so I apologize if I can't answer any super technical questions as it relates to cams, but I'll do my best. So I wanted to talk a little bit about who Surfline is, what we do. We were founded in 1985 by Sean Collins, who many look at as the godfather of recreational surf forecasting. So Surfline started mainly as a business that aimed to tell Southern California surfers when and where to go surfing. We've changed significantly over the last 32 years, and we're now global. We've got brands. Our main brand is Surfline, and we still provide surfers information on when and where to go surfing, but all over the world. We also have a property in the fish space, which is called Fish Track, where we provide offshore fishing tools to a variety of fishermen and women and other use cases. And we also maintain Buoy Weather, which was essentially picking up the data that produces the forecast on Surfline and repackaging it into a marine product, which is buoyweather.com. Our lives changed significantly over the last 3 months because we acquired our biggest competitor in Magic Seaweed. So all the plans we had kind of stopped for over the last 4 or 5 months. The biggest thing we've been working on is basically updating our website into the modern era to become a responsive browser and upgrade a lot of our legacy products. But that kind of took a little bit of a stop because we acquired Magic Seaweed, and the really exciting thing about that is we now have the ability to connect over 4 million surfers each month around the world. Surfline's audience was really, really big in the U.S. and Hawaii and a couple international markets, but Magic Seaweed, on the other hand, who also provides forecasts and other data products for waves and other marine purposes, their audience was ginormous in Europe and a lot of other international markets that we didn't have a big audience in. So now we're really excited where we can reach surfers in ways that we never have all around the world. So Surfline, we have 80 employees, plus or minus a handful, 10 meteorologists, 4 wave modelers / data engineers. And so we've got a full-on operation as it relates to the atmospheric and coastal sciences. And we work 365 days a year, and it's something it's the longest tenured part of our business is the forecast department, which really is 32 years old. How do we support ourselves? We 3 main ways. The biggest one is subscriptions. You have to pay a price basically to access our full webcam streams, our forecasts, and our expert analysis. But another couple other parts of our business are related to advertising and consulting as well. Something that you may not be aware of when you think of Surfline is we do actually have a fairly significant amount of relationships and partnerships that I'm going to talk a little bit about today as it relates to IOOS with a variety of academia, government agencies, and media. For example, we recently signed a partnership with the Army Corps of Engineers in Southern California where they want to study the impacts of beach renourishment on surf quality. So we're well underway on that project right now, another really exciting project that's on the other side of the country. So we offer a wide variety of content. We're basically an online magazine for surfers, webcams that I'm talking about today, data as it relates to waves and winds around the world, expert meteorologist analysis, and we do this to make surfers' lives better via our apps, websites, APIs, wearables. Our APIs feed into a variety of watches and other devices, and also other syndication platforms. We're really proud of what we've done with the non-endemic market, which is basically anything but surf, with some of the stuff we're providing with the news and media agencies, where we've got a syndication platform where they can stream our live cams during events, and you may have seen that during some of the recent hurricane activity on the East Coast. So a little bit about our webcam network. We've got 435 total webcams around the world. The vast majority of those are domestic in the U.S. and Hawaii, although we do have a growing network in Europe that became even bigger once we acquired Magic Seaweed. We've got about 6 or 7 in Israel. Believe it or not, people do surf in Israel, and a couple other international places around the world, including Indonesia and a couple other places as well. So a little bit about how it's broken up, our camera network. First of all, I'm not going to go over this little diagram here, but just to mention that the different colors represent where we have our cams around the world, and we have 58 in the SECOORA area of responsibility, which is a big opportunity for SECOORA because we can take advantage of some of our existing assets. For example, if we can't find a host, and I've got a use case for that in a following slide that I'm going to go over. But 58 cams throughout the SECOORA network from the Outer Banks south, including the Gulf of Mexico. So a little on how we use surf cams at Surfline. This is probably a black screen for you, but it's going to show something in a second. This is a stream from last January, just a little clip from South Beach, Miami. And this only happens a couple times a year in South Beach. As you're well aware, South Beach isn't the most blessed place in the world for great waves because it's kind of blocked by the Bahamas and a couple other factors that limits its wave potential. But when they get waves like this, people want to know, and one of our jobs at Surfline is to make sure that they can get real-time information to see what the waves are like before they drive to the beach, because for those of us that have lived or have visited South Florida, the traffic isn't the best place in the world. So, but if it's like this, you want to know, and you want to get to the beach as soon as possible. So this is our primary use for surf cams. So we want to put people into waves like this so they can enjoy their passion in surfing. That being said, there are a lot of other things we do with cams as well. Obviously, one of those with the WebCAT project, but I mentioned the media platform we have, the syndication platform. This doesn't show up that well because I literally took a picture with my iPhone of my TV on DirecTV, but this is just an example from Hurricane Matthew, I guess about a year and a half ago or a little over a year ago, where Jacksonville and Daytona were under the gun from storm surge as Matthew was tracking up the coast. And our cams captured it really well and actually stayed online much longer than we anticipated. And this is just an example of when we were on ABC News where we were sharing the screen with President Obama. So it was a pretty special moment for us at Surfline. So we do actually have a formal partnership with the IOOS program office in Silver Spring, Maryland. We entered a partnership with IOOS in early 2017. And essentially, there's a lot of paperwork that comes down to a few things, and really it's an agreement related to utilizing expertise and assets on both the Surfline side and the IOOS side for the greater good of the nation and observing and modeling systems throughout the nation. And we've got a couple line items in that agreement related to CAMs, modeling, and more. One of the first use cases that we had that came out of this CRADA was we started having discussions with the IOOS program office related to using HF radar sites as a potential place to host webcams, not on the radar, not on the CODAR instrument itself, but some of the hardware. There's a shed. This is an example from Brigantine, New Jersey, this image here, where we actually installed a cam on top of that shed. And this streams on Surfline and also streams on the IOOS.us website, and just kind of was the way we got this whole CRADA off the ground, if you will. But the WebCAT project that we're talking about today kind of exemplifies what we intended to do with the CRADA, which again is use expertise from both the private sector and the public sector to really do something that would be very difficult to do if you didn't tap into each other's resources. And for example, with this project, SECOORA and IOOS don't necessarily need to become experts in streaming webcams and installing webcams and maintaining them, because we've done that for a long, long time, and they can take advantage of our expertise there, as Debra mentioned. So a couple more slides here. So just a couple bullet points on the cams we're using for the WebCAT project. They've got 30x optical zoom, 720p resolution, although we can go 1080 where bandwidth allows. Our cams stream at 30 frames per second with an average bit rate of 1.5 to 1.75 megabytes per second. We can have the cams fixed on a particular view, which is probably what we're going to do for some of the wave run-up cams, or we can have them move around. That's an easy change. On the back end, we don't need to go out to the cam to do that. And all the stuff above is customizable to meet SECOORA's and any other stakeholders' needs. The streams are done through local internet connections, although we have done a handful through cell connections as well. This is gradually becoming easier and easier, although we do run into data cap problems quite frequently when we try to do that. There's a couple ways around it, but for the most part, we look at bringing in our own internet connection. We've got a process where we save all of our recorded streams for 5 days on Amazon Cloud Services, and we do that in 10-minute increments, and we're going to be shipping those streams, both live and our archive streams, to Kyle at Axiom, and it sounds like he's going to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But just a few bullet points there on some of the technical aspects, and that's about as technical as I can get on the webcam, so I apologize. So we've completed, or almost completed, about 2 out of the 5 that we got funding for the WebCAT project. The first one, and this I would say actually is about 80% done, is 40th Street, Miami. We already had a cam there, so it was nice that we could just basically knock on their door, change the view around to fit the needs of our stakeholders at the USGS, Greg, the NOAA, and also the National Weather Service to measure rip currents. This was a nice case where, again, we could just repackage some existing assets and utilize it for the SECOORA project. Another one that we just installed about 2 weeks ago is at Cape Hatteras, and this one also is going to be used to measure wave run-up and rip currents, and the National Weather Service in Morehead City is also going to be utilizing this to help in their coastal flood warning operations. And I'll show a quick little stream of this. You probably can't tell that this is streaming because the waves were next to flat this day, but you can probably see maybe a couple cars go by. But this one's live on the back end, and if there's time, maybe I can show you a clip of this at the end of the talk. But yeah, this one's live and ready to go. We're in kind of final processing mode here before we start shipping this stuff over to Axiom. The image on the right, just as a photo from one of the photographers here on the Outer Banks, Daniel Pullen. This is an extremely prone area to coastal flooding, and they recently completed a large beach renourishment project right in front of this hotel. So it's going to be interesting to see how an area that historically is very prone to ocean overwash and other coastal hazards kind of evolves, as it relates to the recent beach renourishment project. Those are all the slides I had, and I guess we're turning it over to the next presenter, and I'm looking forward to taking any questions at the end.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. Joe, you're up next if you want to go ahead and take controls.
Okay. Do you have to send it over to me, or?
You're going to have to take them yourself,
so
the computer with the three, perfect.
Okay. Okay, can you see that first slide, Abby?
Yes, Sunset Beach Treasure Island?
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay, so my name is Joe Long, and there's a colleague of mine is also on the line, Jenna Brown. We're both with the USGS at the St. Petersburg Coastal and Marine Science Center. And I'm going to give just a very brief use case or sort of an end user of the data that Mark and Debra were describing, and in particular for the case of wave run-up. So the USGS, if you're not familiar, is in charge of or charged with, my slide's not advancing there, there you go. We have sort of this unique goal of studying the nation's coastline in order to identify, quantify, and eventually model the vulnerability of the U.S. coastlines to coastal change hazards. And there's a lot of things, obviously, that can drive coastal change in the nearshore environment, and we've sort of lumped these into individual drivers, including studying the impacts of severe storms and hurricanes, long-term or chronic changes in the shoreline, and then the coastal vulnerability to changes driven by sea level rise. And for many of those cases, or in case of the severe storms or hurricanes, we're looking at how we expect the coast to change during some of these events. And I have just a few snapshots here of potential ways the coast may look after a storm event, whether it be from beach erosion, so water levels reaching only to the upper beach face, whether those water levels are eroding dunes that are protecting things behind those dunes like roadways or infrastructure, whether storms will overwash in certain environments and block roadways, or whether we'll have potential inundation or complete flooding of the beach and dune system, causing potentially barrier island breaches. And one of the big things, or one of the big drivers for any of those is wave run-up. And so we have a lot of operational models for sort of mean sea level, what surge and tides look like on top of that mean sea level, but not really the component of wave run-up. Essentially, how far are waves going to drive water up the beach? And it's really that intersection of water with the beach, or do those water levels essentially get to the base of the dune, that drives what our coast is going to look like after one of these events happens. And so this is just a movie taken from Sunset Beach along the Gulf Coast of Florida. This was during Tropical Storm Colin, and you can see the scarp in the dune caused by these water levels, or essentially the wave run-up reaching as high as it did. And so one of the things we've embarked on as a partnership with the National Weather Service is to develop a real-time or operational model for total water levels. And by that I mean both surge and tides, but then also adding in this component of wave run-up so that we can really get a sense of where water levels will be on the beach each hour, each day, and then being able to use that to drive what we expect the type of coastal change to be. And so this is a total water level viewer. You can access all of the information from this operational model there. It's a 6-day forecast, and it's driven by the individual wave and water level forecasts that are being made by the National Weather Service weather forecast offices. And then the USGS adds in measured topography and dune elevations, and in order to estimate or predict what the wave run-up will be. And just a real quick, you see this graph on the right-hand side. You see the dashed line, which is really the water level due to surge and tides. And then the solid blue line indicates the total water level, or surge plus tides plus wave run-up. So essentially, again, the intersection of the water and the beach. And then we compare where that water level is at each hour to features like the base of the dune or the crest of the dune. And what that does is it identifies times and durations to when we expect these types of coastal impacts, whether it be dune erosion or dune overtopping. But because wave run-up is a primary driver of those different types of coastal change, we need to validate the model in terms of its wave run-up component. And we've been doing that through video remote sensing, similar to the camera data that Mark described. And we've been doing this both at Duck, North Carolina, and then also at a station we set up on Madeira Beach on the Gulf Coast of Florida. And it's been there streaming data for about a year now on top of a 6-story hotel and looking along the coastline. And one of the things that I think we're sort of focused on this project, or the data use that's coming out of this WebCAT project, is trying to transform the camera data into something that we can use for quantitative information. And so by that I mean, during the installation of the camera, and what we did at Madeira Beach is to use what we call ground control points. You'll see these checkerboard patterns along the beach, and they stretch up and down within the field of view. And we survey those positions, so we get an actual latitude and longitude of where that position is. And now we know something about the camera geometry. And the other thing we have to do is what we call intrinsic camera calibrations. And so you can see the horizon sort of bending in the background of this image. And that's because cameras just inherently distort the picture based on the lens. And so there are ways that you can correct for that distortion, and then also the geometry of looking along this field of view. And by doing that, we can transform an image from something that's in just pixel coordinates itself to something that's in real-world coordinates, so that every pixel now becomes an instrument that you're using to sample in terms of something quantitative. Everything now is sort of mapped into these UTM locations, or latitude longitude locations, and so now we can measure change through time. And so we do this, we've done this at our Madeira Beach location, and it's something we're working to do at both the Cape Hatteras and the Miami Beach location that Mark mentioned. And we need that information. We need what we call the rectification of this image, taking it from pixel coordinates to real-world coordinates so that we can track things like the water level through time. So each blue dot now that you see on this image on the left is a sampling location. It's just as though we had put an instrument on the beach in that location. It's just that the image itself, or the pixel itself, is providing us that information. And one example of that for wave run-up is if you look along one of these, the pixels along one of these red dashed lines, if we track those pixels through time, you get the kind of image you see on the right, which is tracking a wave crest as it comes up the beach and then back down the beach, and then up the beach and back down the beach, and you track that through time. And that tells you where the water level has reached, and is a way for us to validate that wave run-up component that I talked about. And so we're using this camera location and the other camera location I talked about to validate this model that we have for total water level. And I picked out just one instance here where the model is indicating, if you look at the vertical gray line, the model is indicating that water levels should be starting to approach the base of the dune, that's that dashed horizontal line, at this time. And so we take the wave run-up information we see from the camera, and we actually plotted the prediction, which is the red line, on the camera image from that hour, and it shows you that the model is predicting essentially how far, or that intersection of the water line and the beach during that hour. And then that gives us an indication of what the coastal hazard associated with it is. And so that's really how we're using the data in terms of its, or estimating wave run-up. But I think the other thing that's important to note is that there's value in sort of standardizing the video data, or the collection of that video data, as some of the cameras are installed. And that's maybe could broaden the applications. And so by having images, by taking care of those intrinsic or extrinsic parameters, that being the lens distortion and the camera geometry, you can measure all sorts of things besides just wave run-up. We can get the wave run-up, but we can also track shorelines through time. You see sort of a stack of images here that shows you a beach cusp formation of the shoreline in the top image on March 3rd, and 20 days later we have this huge buildup of sand along this groin field, which then went away about 6 days later, and you're back to straight shoreline. And then by May, you have these big cuspate features forming within the groins. And so we can track that shoreline position through time quantitatively, because we've rectified these images. We can do the wave run-up. We can also look at bathymetry. So you can use these pixels, and you can use the signatures of the waves that are coming from offshore to onshore to actually estimate what the bathymetry is. And so we use techniques to do that. You see an application of that on the right, which shows you sort of a sandbar location followed by a trough and then the beach. And we compare those to in situ, or surveys we've done of the beach, to see how accurate those are. and then also using the cameras for storm response to identify locations of dune collision and overwash. So I think there's probably many more use cases than you're going to hear today, but hopefully we can help get the data in a format that is applicable for a wide range of uses. And so I have just some links here: our Coastal Change Hazards portal, a website for the images that we're collecting at Madeira Beach, and the total water level viewer, and our contact information, which will, I guess, all be recorded as part of this. So feel free to get in touch.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. So Greg, you're going to be up next, and you should see your presentation now.
Okay. Thanks. My name is Greg Dusek. I'm a senior scientist with the Center for Operational Oceanographic Products and Services with the National Ocean Service. Also want to recognize Michael Churma with the National Weather Service, who's been really the point person for all things rip current related with the Weather Service, in particular with rip current forecasting. And so I'm going to briefly just cover two use cases for the camera data, rip currents and high tide flooding. I can go to the next slide. So for rip currents, what we're predominantly want to use the camera data for is for rip current model validation. So we have a probabilistic rip current forecast model, which is being validated at coastal locations across the U.S. This is being tested through National Weather Service weather forecast offices, and this has been a joint effort between the Weather Service and Ocean Service. And predominantly for the forecast model thus far, we've relied on lifeguard observations, visual observations of rip current intensity for both the model development and model validation. And for the most part, I have to say that the lifeguard observations have been really quite good. We've done some research comparing our model to in situ observations of rip currents, and that has shown very good results. So we're pretty confident in the visual observations that the lifeguards provide, but there's obviously some limitations with that data. And in particular, lifeguard presence is a key requirement to have that data, and there's not lifeguards everywhere that we can utilize. And then the subjective nature of visual observations, meaning lifeguards in one location might see things different than lifeguards somewhere else in a different place in the country. And so what we really wanted to do is find better ways to identify rip currents to help support our model validation. And being that in situ observations of rip currents are incredibly difficult due to the surf zone, changing surf zone and bathymetry and wave conditions, camera data seems like one of the best options to do this. You can go to the next slide. So this is a picture from a previous camera deployment we did in southern North Carolina at Emerald Isle a couple years ago. And this is just a snapshot in time. And cameras have been used quite a bit through the research community in terms of identifying rips, as well as a number of other factors, a lot of which Joe went into, like looking at the bathymetry, which is also important for rip current forecasting. And in this case, if you can go to the next slide, what we did with this test is predominantly looked at the time averaged images, which you can see here. And so if you average a bunch of these snapshots together at a location, you can start to pretty clearly see where waves are breaking and where they're not breaking. And where that arrow is, you can see just offshore you have a break in the line of breaking waves, which indicates the presence of a rip channel and a rip current. And so this type of approach of identifying rip currents isn't new, but it hasn't been used in an operational way or really in a forecast validation approach before. And our first attempt at doing it in Emerald Isle had mixed results. A big reason of it being that the cameras weren't set up in such a way so that we could really have good standardized data, like Joe mentioned. And so what we're hoping to do here is, through working with USGS and other researchers, making sure that these cameras are set up such that we can get consistent standardized data that we can then use to identify rips, not just manually. So in this approach, people actually went through the images and identified where they saw these breaks, but also doing it in an automated way to tell us if there's a rip present or not, to really help with the model validation. You can go to the next slide. The other aspect that we hope to use the cameras for are for high tide flooding observations. And so high tide flooding, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, is also sometimes called nuisance flooding or sunny day flooding, and it's coastal flooding that's influenced by the tide. And it occurs even when weather's pretty good, and typically occurs during your highest tide periods of the year. An example of it you can see there in that picture was down in Annapolis last month when I was at the boat show. It was a pretty normal day, nothing out of the ordinary weather-wise, but there was a high tide and there was favorable winds, and all of a sudden we had water in the streets at the boat show. And so the high tide flooding is becoming more frequent due to sea level rise, and will continue to become more frequent. And it's also then becoming more impactful in terms of the damage it can cause and the problems it can cause from an infrastructure perspective. And so in my office, we've been working closely with the Weather Service, and we provide annual outlooks of high tide flooding and then also seasonal high tide bulletins, which tell you when and where high tide flooding is likely to occur. But one of the challenges we have with our products is that it's hard to relate our forecasts and our water level data with actual impacts on the ground. Most of our work is based off of thresholds of flooding set by the weather forecast offices based on previous observations, but there's not a lot of data to kind of validate things in real time to help support our models, but then also to inform people what conditions look like. You know, when the water hits a certain level, what does that mean to you? What does that look like in the streets, and how often are you going to see that more and more going forward in time? You can go to the next slide. And so we've done some work already trying to utilize just static images from cell phones and whatnot, like you can see here in Morehead City, where if we have the time and the location that the picture was taken, we can then relate it to our water level data, which you can see on the bottom there in the plot, and say, a water level of X amount at one of our tide gauges equates to flooding that might look like what you see in the picture there. And that's a useful way to, kind of communicate the potential risks to people and what the impacts look like, but less useful for model validation because obviously they're just somewhat by chance in terms of where we might get those images. And so what we would like to do is to set up a webcam that's focused more on an urban area. Unlike the coastal cams like Joe mentioned, something like this would be in a place like downtown Charleston, which we're looking at, and it would focus on a location that frequently experiences high tide flooding, and then we'd be able to relate the water levels observed at our gauges with the pictures that we're seeing of potential impacts and flooding amounts through the cams. And this would be a huge help to us to really better ensure that what our forecasts are predicting is accurate, and then also help, again, convey impacts to the public. And so we're hoping to do Charleston, as I mentioned. That's a little bit up in the air, I guess, but if it's not that location, I think somewhere down the line we'll be able to pursue this and use what we learn in this year-long trial period to be able to better set up how we want these cams to be able to observe this phenomenon. And that's all I have, and I'll be happy to answer questions at the end as well.
Great, thank you so much. And so, Dwayne, you are up next.
Sorry, I was on mute. And I have a slide or two to throw up if I can grab control here.
Yes, just give me one second. I'm going to promote you to presenter, and you might be prompted to download something. And it should only take a couple minutes.
Let's see. Is that right there? Doo-doo-doo.
And I just want to remind everybody while Dwayne is getting this set up, if you have any questions for the presenter, you can type them in the bottom left-hand chat box, and I'll pose them to the presenter at the end of the presentation.
So it says I should be ready to go.
Do you see a screen that says stop meeting, stop recording, and then share?
Let's see here. Yes, I do.
All right. If you want to hit that share button, and you can share one of your monitors.
Okay, let's see here. Share. Well, apparently that doesn't want to work, so I can just talk through this pretty quickly then, if that's okay.
That is fine. I'm sorry it's not working.
No, wait, there it did.
All right. We see your calendar.
Let's see if the rest of it will show up here then. Doo-doo. So apparently PowerPoint's just really slow here on this today. Well, maybe it'll come up in a second, but I'll just go ahead and talk through it real quick. So I am representing the National Estuarine Research Reserve Program, and for those of you that may not be as familiar with the NERS as you are with SECOORA, we are a constellation of 29 and now almost 30 reserves situated around the country, stretching from Ketchimak Bay, Alaska, down to Hobos Bay, Puerto Rico, and 28 locations in between that are engaged in a partnership program to support research, education, and monitoring. And as related to all three, the reserve system has a system-wide monitoring program where each reserve monitors for specific environmental parameters in a consistent way at every single reserve. So regardless as to whether you're sitting on the West Coast or the East Coast or the Gulf Coast or the Great Lakes, you're monitoring in the same manner. Due to the biogeographical differences of our reserves, there are a number of other monitoring programs that take place at the level of the local reserve. And many of these monitoring programs are community engaged programs, i.e. the monitoring involves not only reserve staff, but also the communities themselves. And we monitor for any number of things that are tied to the environment. These monitoring programs can be pretty labor intensive, and therefore there's the opportunity that we miss out on a lot of or some of whatever we're monitoring for. So when we had the opportunity to become engaged in this project, we began to think about what are the things that we monitor at an individual reserve or a regional collection of reserves that may be supported by the use of video cameras. And admittedly, we are all newbies at the use of video technologies for supporting or assisting our monitoring efforts. And we identified some issues that are tied to water quality, that are tied to habitat, etc., that we're monitoring for, and we'd like to assess how well, how effectively the video technology can support the monitoring efforts. So we identified a couple things that we would like to focus in on, and then initially decided, let's take a look at what's going on in the St. Augustine, Florida area, where the reserve, in partnership with the community of St. Augustine, has a right well passage monitoring program in place. And so during the time of the year that the right whales are migrating, we have folks that sit out on the beach and physically count the passages of whales, usually evidenced by a breach of a whale. And we decided, let's take a look at how well we can begin to record these events using the video cameras. So partnering with the GTM Reserve and the community of St. Augustine, we're proposing to work with Surfline for the installation of a camera in that area that literally will be in support of an ongoing monitoring program. And the hope or the expectation is that this will be a demonstration project of the utility of video cameras for the type of applications that are important to the reserves and the communities with which they reside and serve. And assuming a level of success, we've already had one other reserve that has asked about the possibility of becoming engaged, and that is a reserve here in South Carolina, the Ace Basin Reserve, where they have an issue that we have another project going on where we're doing bacterial source tracking, and we have identified through the use of the qPCR technology that the bacteria that we're finding in the beach swimming waters is coming primarily from dogs and birds. And so the interest of the town officials on Edisto Beach is to mount a camera to begin to tabulate when and where the dogs and birds are, and then do a correlative assessment to determine if, in fact, there is a relationship between the dog population and when we're seeing water quality concerns. So from the reserve perspective, we see this as the tip of the iceberg. We don't know exactly what we can achieve with the integration of these cameras with video systems with our other monitoring efforts, but it's a pretty exciting opportunity to be engaged with. So hopefully in the not too distant future, we will get a camera up and running down at the GTM Reserve and begin the process of assessing the effectiveness of these video systems for supporting our monitoring efforts. And with that, I will stop for any questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Dwayne. I'm going to go ahead and take controls. It looks like the PowerPoint didn't load, but if you could send it to me, I'll make sure it's posted on the website.
Okay.
All right. So we have our first question for you, Mark, is what kind of cameras are you using and where could somebody purchase them?
Great question that I'm not going to give a clear answer to because Dennis Murphy's not on the call, our cam technician. But the easy answer is we use a ton of different vendors for cam hardware that all have a variety of different zooms and capabilities, and then we pick the vendor based on the use case need. In this case, I think there's a couple of different ones we're looking at, but yeah, I'd have to ask Dennis, the manufacturer. But that's only one part of it. The other part is, we do use a couple of different Amazon services to stream and deliver everything to the end user. So that's the hardware is one part, and then the streaming stuff is kind of the more complicated and expensive part.
Great, thank you. And then we have a question from Spencer Rogers for you, Greg, and it is, what is the status of the risk current forecast research?
We're making progress with it, I guess. I mean, it's kind of a broad question. I could give a lot of information about it. We actually just gave so what I can say is we just gave a talk, a NOAA talk a month ago or a few weeks ago or so, and I'd be happy to send the PowerPoint to Spencer so he can kind of get a rough overview of where it all stands. I'll send that along to him. Okay,
great. And then we have another question for you, Greg, from Chris Brewster. And he said, can camera observations determine the speed and intensity of rip currents or only the presence or absence of rips?
Yeah, that's a great question from Chris. So it depends how the cameras are set up. I think up to this point, and for this project in particular, we'd just be looking at presence or absence of rips. However, you can get speed if you have cameras set up in a certain way by doing like particle tracking and things like that. So that's certainly something for the future. But yeah, right now we're looking at presence of rips, which is why for some of these locations we have selected areas that have lifeguards already present that we're collecting data from, so we can kind of combine those two data sources and look at them concurrently.
Great. And then we have another follow-up question from Chris is, must there be a break in the Surfline to identify a rip?
Well, there usually will be a break in the breaking wave patterns, and especially when you average over time, you'll see it. I mean, if you're looking at bathymetry-driven rips, I think it's probably safe to say that transient rips might be a little bit harder to see via camera data because they can move over time. But yes, if you're talking about bathymetry-driven rips, you would expect to see a line in the break.
Thank you so much. And then Debra, we have a question from Jody Patterson. She said, National Marine Sanctuaries are also engaged with research, education, and monitoring. Is there an interest in hosting underwater cameras in SECOORA's region, specifically at Gray's Reef?
I would say I'm not sure that we could do it with this project, but I would be happy to talk to Jody and other folks at Graves Reef about potentially hosting a camera feed. I know that there are a lot of users that would be very interested in what could be seen underwater.
Great, thanks so much. And then Mark, we have a question from Dave Esslinger. He is asking, what are the power and internet requirements for the cameras? 120V and a wired internet, or could it be battery, solar powered, and Wi-Fi? If so, what's the Wi-Fi range?
All right, you guys are really testing this meteorologist's knowledge, but so it's like 30 watts is all we need, which is similar to a 30-watt light bulb. So not much power. The most important thing with streaming it is the upload speed, and I think the best for what we use is we need 1.5 megabytes per second upload. The download is pretty minimal. We've done that on cell before, but again, we usually hit those data caps pretty quick. We don't do solar power ones yet, but we've thought about it, and that would be a great. We've thought a lot about hurricane hardened cams, and maybe that's what you're getting at, but we don't do a lot of that stuff now, but we've tested some things, and we're very open to do that kind of stuff.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. And then Dwayne, we have a question from Mitchell Roffer. How are you digesting the positive activity, for example, dog presence, dog pooping? Is it an artificial intelligence system that IDs the animals or done by hand?
At this point, we really don't know, because as I indicated, we're just newbies in this, but ultimately we would like to be able to look at ways in which we could automate the digital image processing to do some type of video recognition. So I suspect that we will begin with probably a series of student projects where we're doing the visual assessment, and then parallel to that, hopefully working with some folks from our remote sensing and image processing program here to see if there is a way that we can automate the process.
Great, thank you. And we just have, being conscious of the time for 2 more questions. I have one from Carolyn Rhodes to Joe Long. Can you speak to what kind of camera is at the Madeira Beach installation and how they transmit and store the data?
Sure. Yeah, we have a Priscillica Gigi camera there, and I could actually just cut and paste the product sheet into the chat line if anybody wants it. And we have a camera, or we have a computer. The camera's on the roof. We run an Ethernet cord down to the elevator room. We have a computer there, and it does the processing. We have a code on there that does the processing of the individual snapshots to average them and collect pixels along certain transects. And then the hotel has provided us local internet service, and we transfer the images and the products to our USGS FTP site.
Great. Thanks so much, Joe. And then our last question is from Kathleen O'Keefe, and she is asking you, Mark, what kind of problems do you have with fouling on the cameras?
I'm sorry, with what on the cameras?
Fouling, like any damage to the cameras? Do you get like bird?
Yeah. So the big problem that we've had in the past is actually vandalism. You know, that's been an issue. And the other thing is just the dome that is surrounding the cam. Those things get sandblasted a lot, and it just puts tiny little scratches in the dome. So a place like Cape Hatteras that is out there in the elements, we got to replace that dome. I would say about once a year. So that's a bigger problem. Is kind of just the dome being sandblasted, and we have to replace it. The other thing is we actually contract out cam cleaners at all of our 435 cam locations, because as you can imagine, when the winds are onshore, it kind of gunks up the cam view a little bit. So that's another major part of our operations. We've got to make sure these things are clean. So after onshore winds, when they stop, somebody will actually physically go out there and spray it with water and wipe it down typically. So that's an issue we have to mitigate as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Mark. So that's it that we have for questions. I am putting my email address into the chat box. So if you have any more, just go ahead and email me and I can send it to the right person. I want to thank you guys so much for joining us. Our next webinar is going to be December 19th at 12 p.m. Eastern, and it'll be Christine Buckle from NOAA NCOS who will be discussing their product, What's Your Water Level? And the registration link will be available soon. Thank you all so much. You guys have a great day.